Madam President, we are on the nomination of Congressman Bridenstine to be the new administrator at NASA. And I want to tie it into what I'm going to talk about in a moment because it comes down to presidential appointments and the problems that we're running into here with regards to it. I was not enthused by the nomination, nothing personal against Mr. Bridenstine. I felt that NASA is an organization that needs to be led by a space professional. Unfortunately, a few weeks ago, the acting administrator resigned, or I should say retired, and his last day on the job is the 30th. So it leaves us with the prospect of this incredibly important agency for Florida and the country with a vacancy in its top job, and we're on our second acting administrator. And if you just do the math, even if Congressman Bridenstine were to withdraw and a new vetting process began for a new nominee, by the time it worked its way through the administration, the committee process, the floor, the way things are going here, we could be into February, March at the earliest of next year. There's no way NASA can go 2 years and X number of months without a permanent administrator. And so you make these decisions always under the context that a president should have significant discretion in picking the team. Whether you liked it or not, millions of Americans last year voted for the president. He was elected, and he has a right to govern, and in 4 years, less than 4 years now, 2.5 years, the American people will have a chance once again through our democratic process to opine on whether or not they want him to have a second term. Our job here is to provide advice and consent, which is we are to analyze these nominees and determine whether or not we want to support them. And my view of it is, and it has been the tradition of the Senate for the entire existence of the Republic, that we give great deference to the president on choosing qualifications. We want to make sure that people are qualified, that there's nothing about them that would disqualify them. And it is my view that the more important the job, the more discretion the president deserves. It is why, although I had significant reservations about the nomination of Secretary Tillerson, I decided to support it because I believed the president deserved significant discretion. And then the lower, when you get to the subsecretaries and the like, I think that discretion diminishes. And it's what led me to decide to support Congressman Bridenstine despite my reservations. And it is what I hope will lead my colleagues, at least a sufficient number, to support the nomination of Mike Pompeo to be the Secretary of State. Let me read you some of the previous votes we've had here in the United States Senate. All but one of them predate my service. Colin Powell was confirmed by a voice vote, which is almost unimaginable in the 21st century Senate. But in 2001, on the 20th of January, by a unanimous voice vote, he was confirmed as the Secretary of State. A few years later, in 2005, Condoleezza Rice was confirmed Secretary of State by a vote of 85 to 13. Now, still 13 no's, but nonetheless 85 yeses. I assure you, not everyone who voted for her was happy about her nomination. They didn't necessarily agree with her. One of the people who supported her, I believe, was future President Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton was nominated and confirmed in the Senate by a vote of 94 to 2. And I promise you that a significant number of the members on my side of the aisle may have respected Secretary Clinton but strongly disagreed with her and her views on a number of issues, but nonetheless felt that the president deserved to have his nominee. When she resigned, her replacement was then Senator Kerry, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, with whom I had significant policy disagreements in the Senate and during his time as Secretary of State. And yet I, along with 93 other members of the Senate, supported his nomination, and he was confirmed. Well, now we have the acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a man who is clearly qualified, a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, a person who has served this country in uniform. He served this country in Congress, successful in the private sector, has served as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. We learned over the last couple of days, the president has significant trust in him, so much so that he was willing to send him privately to begin the process of setting the stage for perhaps the most important short-term diplomatic engagement this country will have with North Korea. And by the way, is one of the most important things you want in a Secretary of State is someone the president has confidence in. You've got to have someone that when they go abroad and meet with people, they know that that person is the president's ear and speaks for the administration. Mike Pompeo clearly has that. And yet we face the prospect of significant opposition to the point where there are questions about whether it will pass in the committee, although I think he will pass on the floor. And I just think that's something that I hope people will recalibrate in their thinking. I don't think you have to agree with Mike Pompeo. You most certainly don't have to feel that he's the person you would have picked if you were president, but you need to recognize you're not president. And none of us here are the president. The president deserves to have a team of people that he trusts and can work with who are qualified. I do not believe anyone could argue that Mike Pompeo is not qualified. He is certainly as qualified, in fact, I would argue more qualified than the person who he would replace in terms of experience in this field. And I just hope that people understand that and are willing to be a little bit flexible about this. I understand the interest groups are ginning up. Listen, we have the same thing on our side of the aisle. In full disclosure and candor, when President Obama was the president, there were interest groups on the right of center who constantly pressured Congress to oppose everything, not just legislation, but also nominees. I assure you that I did not get a lot of love mail when I decided to support Secretary Kerry, or Senator Kerry at the time. But it was the right thing to do because he was clearly qualified, and that's what the president wanted. And that's why I hope that that's what we will do in this case and in confirming him, because this nation faces some very significant challenges in foreign policy that need to be immediately addressed, and we simply cannot do that without a Secretary of State. For me, that became quite apparent this weekend. I happened to travel to Lima, Peru, for the Summit of the Americas, and the Vice President attended on the President's behalf because of the situation in Syria. And the Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. Sullivan, was there and did a good job, but there's no replacement for a Secretary of State. We had no Secretary of State at the summit. And the key issue, and one that I think Secretary Pompeo or Director Pompeo have confirmed as Secretary could help with, is the situation in Venezuela. Now, I understand that the headlines are dominated by events in the Middle East and by the geopolitical and economic and trade conflict between the United States and China. But I do want to take a moment to talk about something that I've been speaking about on the floor of the Senate for the better part of 4.5 years, and one that I know that Director Pompeo knows well. We've talked about it extensively, and that is the growing catastrophe that is Venezuela.